Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? I tend not to be in the habit of making super personal videos, but my friend Tim Harper actually does that from time to time and kind of exposes more of his internal struggles and all that sort of stuff. And something had come up recently which I found relevant to my role-playing game experience, and after some thought I figured I'd share it here because I'd started doing this, what I did not realize was going to be sort of a miniature series, responding to a question I got from Rob H., asking about my gamer evolution and, where I stood right now in terms of, mostly bias and preference. And, one of the things, I've talked about and, have talked about quite a bit in the past is preference for things like a lighter rule set. Something that requires fewer operations to get this end result. Things that tend to be easier for me to actually use and more simple to learn. And other times I've talked about the difficulty that I've found, particularly within the past number of years of concentrating while reading, and that's something that I look back in the past and found that was had been an issue for some time. In various concentration in various areas, and that I had developed some measure of coping strategies. And anyhow, I'm at this point I'm kind of exploring other options in terms of helping that along. But I noticed, and I've talked about in previous videos, sometimes this being a stumbling block or a difficulty when I try to learn new games, especially those that have an awful lot going on. But I also have mentioned a few times that I've been in therapy lately, and that's been, horrible and eye-opening and all that sort of stuff, but it's been dealing with some latent childhood traumas and all sorts of issues, which can inform greatly like how I navigate life today. And so there's things that, coping strategies or whatever that just can be crippling in later life, that sort of thing. This is not, news to most people. But something had come up very recently which I found really quite relevant to the biases and preferences I have in role-playing games, and certainly within relevant to my experiences within the past, say few years as I branched out and tried a lot of different games, and some of my reactions to those experiences, that continue to this day. So one of the messages I seem to have gotten early on was that it was not okay to not be good at something. Things like failure, or that period where you just hadn't achieved some kind of mastery over a particular subject or area or activity or skill. This, was associated with a lot of traumatic events in my childhood, for lack of a better word. Some of which were really central and some of which were just kind of tangential and sort of reinforced that. But this idea that that was not a very good experience for me, that it was something that was punished, for lack of a better word, by disapproval or what have you. And it's interesting because I was not, I'm not stupid, not the smartest guy in the entire world, but I found that it was relatively easy for me to learn quite a few things, and being a somewhat precocious child, there was an awful lot of value placed on my ability to perform, to kind of do a trick, to be this smart little kid that could do something. And it seemed to be, the only way that I could get any sort of approval from adults and what have you, whether it be, parents, teachers, the whole 9 yards. And so at some point that seemed to be rather central to my identity or my sense of worth, that sort of thing. But not every subject was something that I could gain mastery over or learn quickly. They were, just like anything in life, there's this point where you discover there's things that, gee, I'm just not really good at that. And some of those things were, physical in nature, and I wasn't very good at sports or anything, related to that. And my inability to perform in those areas was met with, very swift disapproval. And likewise, when I started to encounter some kind of difficulty mastering other things, learning other things, this seemed to also be met with some kind of disapproval and ridicule and what have you, and not just from parents, but from the larger group, so to speak. And these are kind of memories that just started kind of flooding and uncovering, and it actually kind of stemmed, now that you're stuck here listening to me, from talking about vocational stuff and the difficulties I've had looking for different lines of work, and the profound discomfort that brings. The profound discomfort I have when I'm faced with a situation where I don't have mastery over something, or just don't know it at all. And that can, it can be, it's more than just normal discomfort. It can be, rather it has a profound emotional and physical manifestation almost immediately. So, as my therapist says, this represents some kind of deep trauma, and so we're going down the rabbit hole looking for all that kind of stuff. And they tell me it's going to be good for me, but I've noticed that can crop up when learning, say, more complicated role-playing games, things that don't necessarily come to me all at once. And that same kind of feeling of discomfort can show up once again. And there's at least two different kinds of people. There's the people that when they fail at something, they get up and they say, well, I'm going to try harder. And there's other people that would simply give up and have found that rather punishing. I'm not going to do that again because that sucked. And I tend to fall into the latter category for the most part. That's my basic reaction. It's kind of basic, simple learning. The flatworm that sees, well, they don't see it, but if the food's on the other side of the electric shock, they don't say, well, I'll just tunnel through this, it'll be great on the other side. It's like, yeah, I'm not going to do that again, I got to find a different way. And that tends to be how I navigate situations like that. And of course that can lead to problems. As I was talking to my therapist, the kind of picture I had in my head is they're talking about, well, you have this part here where you're just not good at something yet, and then this part over here where there's mastery, and there's a space in between. And immediately what flashed before my eyes was kind of the no man's land in trench warfare during World War I. You just simply don't go there because you're gonna die. And on a deep level, that has that same kind of visceral reaction, or I get that same kind of visceral reaction to that period in between, where you're just simply not good at something, where you're kind of stumbling. As a friend of mine said, well, that's called learning. And I said, well, no kidding. But my experience with that has been unpleasant. And of course, it doesn't mean I can't learn anything. There's various things in life where I've been a quick study. But other areas where it seems more daunting, where I read something 2 or 3 times and it's not making sense, that can be more difficult. I've noticed that, when I'm with other people and they are getting it faster than I am, or they are starting to achieve more mastery, and we're involved in a discussion, say even just like in the middle of a game, and I'm the guy that's not quite understanding what they're talking about, that can be, profoundly disturbing. And, part of the message I got, was it was not okay to not be the smartest person in the room, or at least amongst the top 1% or whatever it happens to be. And that sounds very egotistical, and it is to a certain extent, I guess, but it was more central, or more deeper than that. There was a real withdrawal of approval when that wasn't the case. And I can look back at various moments in my childhood. So it, at a really deep level, in order for me to be okay, in order for me to have any sort of value, it was important to be the guy with the most mastery, or pretty darn close. And so falling behind can have a real unsettling effect, to say the least. And so I've noticed that can impede my ability to want to continue to learn a game that's more complex, to learn any kind of subject that's more complex, because that level of discomfort, of exposure, or of whatever it happens to be at that point, that feeling of being inadequate or not worthy, or almost not having the right to exist, which sounds, ridiculously, over the top. There's a word for that. That doesn't sound like over the top, but you know what I mean. It sounds like exaggerated, hyperbole. On a real fundamental level, that's kind of the message that got drilled into me during childhood. Was that it was that sort of thing. So there's times when it's almost like you feel like you're in a fight for your life, or I'll feel like I'm in a fight for my life in a situation like that. And various people that have experienced trauma that's excuse me, triggered by various types of events. For me, not having mastery over subjects seems to be one of those, which is interesting. As we're talking about this, and it's a very emotional session, I'm thinking about these experiences I'm having in with role-playing games where they're more complicated, where I have more difficulty, mastering them, and coupling that with a difficulty with concentrating in the first place. Whereas I'm sitting down with something and I'm going over charts and tables, and I'm like, a couple paragraphs into it, and I'm just like, wait a minute, is silhouette divided by speed, or speed divided by silhouette, or is it the square root of the armor class, or and I'm trying to figure out some part of a system, and I've already kind of lost what I read a couple paragraphs before, or just not making sense to me at that point. That can be incredibly unsettling, and really lead to almost feelings of low self-worth. And it's one of those things about learning. People, animals, everything. We tend to repeat actions which result in reward, and we tend to avoid repeating actions which end up or produce punishing feelings. And so, for me, that's a rather punishing feeling. So it makes me highly averse to putting myself in situations where I have to learn all that stuff, and I have to walk through that discomfort. I have to go through that uncomfortable period of learning and being in that no man's land, which, for me, feels incredibly dangerous. So that was something that came up. It's not something that I really was excited about talking about here, but it's something I felt was important, and that is kind of revealing. Obviously, my motives or motivations for tackling something like that head on have a lot more to do with how I navigate a lot of life, not just role playing games. But as we're talking about this, and as I was thinking about this, it really kind of struck me. It's like, wow, that really probably has a profound impact on my biases and preferences, my approaches to games. The times when I'm sitting there, with my friends, people that I like and I know that like me, and that aren't going to reject me when we're in the middle of a game, and I'm like, man, this is feeling really, really uncomfortable because I'm not understanding part of this, and they are, and it can really have a one of those very unsettling effects where I just kind of pretty much think, well, I made a big mistake, and I just want to grab my stuff and go home, and I'll go play a game that I understand, and maybe even declare this game that's complex, sour grapes, that sort of thing. Which is not to say that some of them aren't sour grapes. I don't like all of them. Some of them just don't do it for me. But that was something that came up, and I figured it would be worthy of sharing and putting out there. And at the end of the day, I'm sure there's probably a lot of you that can't relate at all. But I wonder if there's people out there that can have had similar experiences, or that this strikes a chord or resonates with them in some way. I'd be interested to hear about that. Have a good day. Take it easy, kids.